morning.
Good morning. I'm counting faces just to make sure we have a quorum, which doesn't look like we, 1, 2, 3. Brian, Gwen, and Stacy will be late, so maybe we will do minute approval at the end, Ashley, just to make sure we get those approved.
And Marta, Jordan sent a message too that he'll be 5 to 10 minutes late as well.
Yeah, so maybe we will shuffle things around a little bit just to make sure. But this is not, we don't have it's an informational item only. So we don't need to, we won't wait for them. Okay, so Ashley, are we good?
Yes, I'm ready to go.
Okay, so I'm going to get us going just because I think this is a session and I want to make sure we have enough time for this item. So good morning, everyone. I'm going to call the Public Works Committee order. Today is Wednesday, the March 24th, and we continue to meet via Zoom webinar due to the pandemic. So if you are joining us via this Zoom webinar and would like to provide public comment, please use your raise and lower hand feature to raise your hand, and I will call on you to provide public comment. If you are participating by phone, you can raise and lower your hand by using *9 and *6 to mute and unmute yourself. If you want to provide general comments or comment on a specific agenda item, you can always call us and leave a voice message for the entire council. You can call 406-552-6012, and you can always email council at council@ci.missoula.mt.us. And we will see if we have anyone from the public. I just see Jordan Henson. He is a journalist, so don't think he wants to provide public comment. We will approve our minutes at the end of the meeting once we have quorum. So our only item today is a presentation about the long-range transportation plan, and Erin Wilson and Jennifer Wheeland are here to present. So take it away, Erin.
All right, thanks. Well, appreciate you all taking some time for us to be here and talk about the long-range transportation plan update. We've been sort of madly doing work over the last several months to try to get this plan ready to go and adopted on more or less on schedule and keeping up with all of the work that we've had to do. So we've got an update. I think the last time we were here was in December, I believe, when we were in our last round of public outreach. We're in another round of public information gathering before we draft the plan. So pretty excited about that. And I think we've got some good information to share, and it's a really good opportunity for council to provide us some feedback on where we're at before we get into drafting the plan. So, and we do have Jennifer here with Nelson Nygaard, who's one of our consultants. And so we're gonna kind of tag team this presentation as we go through it. Jennifer, do you wanna share the slides or take control?
There we go. Does that look okay, Erin?
Yes, that looks great.
Full screen, okay.
All right. So just going into an overview of what we want to focus on today, we're going to discuss a little bit of our draft recommended scenario and illustrative projects. So this is taking all of the work that we did through the end of last year and January and trying to refine our ideas and come up with what is going to be the recommended plan and the projects that we're recommending for funding. We also want to start introducing some of our programs and policy recommendations and get some feedback, particularly from council. I think this could be a really interesting point of discussion. So those items and recommendations in the plan that aren't necessarily an infrastructure project on the ground, but are going to be equally important for achieving the goals of the plan. And then we have a brief overview of our current engagement and outreach activities, including some open houses coming up this evening and tomorrow. And then we'll wrap up with an overview of our next steps towards getting that draft plan and having it adopted hopefully by early summer. I think June is our timeline. So lots to do still, but we're sort of rounding the corner into the finish line of this project. So I think we're at a pretty exciting point where we can start actually talking about what we're recommending. So I'll give kind of a quick overview of how we got to this recommended scenario, and then turn it over to Jennifer to talk through what's involved in that, and then transition into the programs and policies. So as with all of the different stages of this process, we started early on identifying our community values and looking at previous plan goals and all of the other work that's going on around Missoula to establish what we call our Missoula Connect goals. And so these are the underpinnings of all of the work that we're doing in terms of how we're evaluating projects, how we're evaluating scenarios, and essentially the goals that we're trying to implement with this plan. And so we've presented these a lot. I think hopefully they should be fairly familiar now, so I won't go into any great detail, but just as a reminder that we do have these goals. They are the foundation of all of the work that we've been doing, and will be underpinning everything that we include in terms of recommendations in the long range plan. So trying to make sure that we have a really focused plan, and that it really is goal driven, and that we're tying those goals to other community values and plans and policies, and trying to wrap everything together. So within the plan and how we've gotten to this recommended scenario, we've been using our evaluation framework. It's a 5-step process that started I guess last spring, where we did a public call for projects. We had people submit all of their ideas for necessary improvements to our transportation system. We looked at previous plans and projects. We pulled all of that together into sort of a world of potential projects and needs that we could address in this plan. And then we walked through a number of steps where we screened projects for applicability for a long range plan. We did some initial scoring based on those goals and some metrics that we could quickly and efficiently evaluate each project individually and how well it met those different goals and metrics. And then we developed scenarios in order to evaluate the impacts of different combinations of projects. So not just the value of each individual project on its own, but how do they work together to help us achieve those goals. And so now we've gone through that process. We'll give a quick overview of sort of where we landed. And now we're on these last steps of prioritizing and recommending projects for our inclusion in our final plan. So if you'll remember back in December when we presented, we were talking about 3 different transportation scenarios. These were in addition to 2 growth scenarios that we used to sort of evaluate how each of these will work with different potential growth patterns. But we wanted to come up with these 3 scenarios that each had multimodal improvements. We're improving transportation for all modes. We wanted to come up with scenarios that address our different growth needs, but maybe do those in slightly different ways. So just in brief summary, the 3 scenarios as we have them here, the first was new connections, and this was primarily focused on larger infrastructure projects that create new roadways or new multimodal facilities, complete streets projects, really emphasizing those new connections as opposed to in existing facilities. So the second scenario we called enhanced connections, and as the name indicates, was really focused on improving existing facilities. So things like neighborhood greenways that can improve our local street neighborhood connections, or targeted complete street connections, or filling those key trail gaps in our existing system. And then regional equity, it was a scenario that we pulled sort of a combination of projects from new connections and enhanced connections, but was really focused on projects that scored very highly on our equity index, were located in Invest Health neighborhoods, or provided some of that regional connectivity and regional equity, that sort of the urban to rural connections that we know is going to be really critical for growth of the region. So those were the three scenarios we developed. There were a lot of details to those. We did a lot of analysis, but that's sort of the quick overview summary of how we developed and what they were. Then we went through a scenario performance evaluation, again, trying to tie our evaluation to those 5 Missoula Connect goals. We had a number of different metrics related to each goal that we evaluated against each of those scenarios. And then we saw how well they promoted that particular goal. And without going into all of the detail here, just the general result of that was that the good news is each scenario achieved, improved our performance for each one of these goals, but they did it in slightly different ways. So for example, in new connections, with those new streets and new connections, did a lot more to potentially to boost freight and some of the economic metrics that we looked at. Enhanced connection was really focused on improving safety and so the improving mobility choices throughout the region. Again, that was partially by intention of the kinds of projects that were included in that scenario. And then we found regional equity also had improvements to safety and some of those multimodal improvements, and then really did a lot more to improve affordability and goals such as connecting and strengthening communities to create a more equitable region. So again, maybe not surprising on that one that we focused really heavily on equity projects, and we had more benefit related to equity and affordability. So, but bottom line, all of these scenarios performed, improved our region related to these goals, just in slightly different ways.
And Aaron, I think the piece that I would add to this, you referenced the 2 different growth scenarios that we looked at as well. And so looking at the business as usual growth, which both of the 2 growth scenarios maintain current city and county growth policies, but strategic growth really focused on growth inward. And what we saw when we analyzed those 2 different land use scenarios against the 3 transportation scenarios is that strategic growth, or that focus on growth inward, really amplified the benefits that we were getting from all 3 of these transportation scenarios, which isn't surprising if you think about it, right? More people concentrated closer together near more destinations really just meant that these scenarios were doing more in terms of connecting people, reducing vehicle miles traveled, and providing opportunities for people to travel by non-driving modes as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. I think that's a really important piece of this, that that land use, and we'll continue to reiterate this at, I think, or at least I will, at every opportunity, that our land use decisions are really impactful on the function of our transportation system. That's true in the reverse as well, that how we invest in transportation can affect our growth, but they're really intertwined, and they do have some synergy between those 2. So thinking about land use is important when we're looking at our transportation system. So we did a big push for public outreach in December, which maybe isn't, December during a pandemic isn't the most ideal time to do community engagement, but we did have pretty good participation. We had a number of public meetings with neighborhoods and reaching out to community councils on the urban fringe outside of the city limits, and had as many as 20 to 30 people attend and as few as 1, which sounds like not very much, but the benefit of having those meetings where only 1 person attends is you get to have a really good in-depth conversation with that individual and get a much better sense of sort of how people are thinking about these scenarios and transportation. And so we did that all through December. We asked some questions at each one of those meetings to look at which of these scenarios people preferred. So there was, and I guess stepping back even further, we started this engagement sort of before we even initiated the long range plan with our regional transportation survey. And so that's something that we do every 4 years, where we do a statistically valid survey and ask a number of transportation questions. And so we used those survey responses to look at these different scenarios and see how well they match what people are saying their priorities are and their concerns. And so that was sort of first step of about community input and how we evaluated scenarios. And then we had these public meetings and an online survey. And what we found is that there's generally a preference for the enhanced connections and the regional equity scenarios. Although I think there was also a mix of all three was equally, in there as well. So people were really drawing on different elements of each scenario in terms of what they were preferring. And so I think that's important as we go into developing our final recommended scenario. We also asked about specific areas and particular projects, and we heard a lot about Brook Street. People were wanting to prioritize the need for more bus service, and then the importance of focusing on older adults and low-income households. Again, sort of that equity component, I think, was really resonating with people when we were engaging with them. That we can use our transportation investments and our transportation system to help move those efforts forward. Anything to add on engagement, Jennifer?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think what you said, Erin, in terms of really trying to understand what were the types of projects that were most important to people, just recognizing that not everybody thinks about an entire network, an entire scenario when they think about transportation. Some folks are really focused on complete streets, others are focused on bridges. And so we did try and tease that out a little bit as well to make sure that when we were shaping the recommended scenario, we could pull in some of that more specific input too.
Yeah, thanks. So that's a good tee off to. I'll hand it over to Jennifer to talk through how we used all of that and how we arrived at our recommended scenario.
All right, great. So thank you, Erin, and good to see you all this morning. As we took that input from folks, we also, as Erin mentioned, went back to the regional travel survey that had been done before we started the project, and then dug back into the analysis to make sure that when we were creating the recommended scenario, we were really building on everything that we'd done throughout the project. So recognizing that preference that people expressed for enhanced connections and regional equity, we started by pulling in all of the projects that were included in both of those two scenarios. And as Erin mentioned when he was giving the quick overview of those, there was some good overlap. So that was a solid set of projects to get us started in shaping the recommended scenario. Then we went through and looked for projects that had been identified by council, by the MPO committees, by our long range plan committees, by the public, and by staff as projects that were critically important for one reason or another. So the Brooks Corridor is a great example of that. Handful of important trail connections, greenway projects that came out in that way as well. The next thing that we did was go back to the equity scoring. So recognizing that there was a lot of emphasis from the public and from our committees in thinking very carefully about affordability, thinking very carefully about equity and connections between neighborhoods where there's historically been less investment. We wanted to make sure that as we were pulling additional projects into the recommended scenario, we continued to prioritize equity. And so identifying those projects with high equity scores led us to be able to pull from all three of the scenarios, which again, as Erin shared the feedback from the public, that was another thing that people wanted to see. Folks did have a preference for enhanced connections and regional equity, but we're really interested in that mix and match and the ability to grab some of the most important projects from all three of the scenarios. So we took that approach as we went through. You may remember that we do have a fiscal constraint that we are tied to. And so it wasn't that we could grab all of the projects for the recommended scenario, but we have a dollar figure of about 181 million over 30 years that we are able to program. There are projects that are identified as committed, which means that they have funding that is programmed for them in the next 5 to 6 years. And so those are in addition to the 180 million cap for the recommended scenario. So what that led us to is the recommended scenario that this is included in your packets. You've got both a list of the projects included as well as this map. And I know it's a little bit hard to see on the screen. We do also have an interactive map that you can link to from the MPO's website, which gives you the ability to turn on and off different types of projects and to be able to explore these in just a little bit more detail. But in that process that we went through in building in our analysis and the input from the public, we feel that we have created a recommended scenario that does really respond to what we heard and to what we learned through the technical analysis. We focused on connecting neighborhoods and really supporting the inward growth. And in doing so, we wanted to be cognizant of some of the other parts of the region that do have significant transportation needs and try to identify some of the core connections that would help to build out the networks that already exist. So I'll give you a few examples of some of these projects as we go through. But again, we did try and think very carefully about the strategic growth scenario in terms of the land use and the growth component of this, and maintain that focus on equity and affordability, as I mentioned. So part of the way we did that was by pulling in those projects. Another way that we did it was by really focusing in on the mix of projects that we were using. So what you see represented in terms of the colors here, the purple projects are complete streets projects. So some of those are new roadways. Some of them are really taking existing roadways and making them more usable for people traveling by bike, people walking or rolling, people on transit, as well as people driving. That is a really important thing about the new Complete Streets connections. We are providing facilities that work for freight. We're providing facilities for people that need to drive, but then really trying to make the transportation system work so that you don't have to drive, so that you do have other options available, which is really important from an equity and accessibility standpoint. So in addition to some of those new Complete Streets connections, and Howard Razor Drive is a great example of one of those. So this important connection up in the North Reserve Scott Street area. Other examples are Johnson Street, Russell Street, and then certainly a project that Council is very familiar with, which is the East Broadway and Highway 200 Complete Street, which of course includes active transportation facilities as well. So those are a few of the key complete streets and new connections that we featured. We also focused on, in green, you see active transportation projects. Many of those are neighborhood greenway projects, so somewhat lower cost investments that really focus on making those connections between neighborhoods and providing safe and comfortable facilities for people of all ages and abilities. And then with the active transportation projects, we did really try and make sure that we were connecting across the region. So some of the regional and inner neighborhood active transportation facilities we felt were particularly important to include in the recommended scenario based on feedback that we'd heard from people. Some of those include the I-90 trail, the 3rd Street bike lane, the Lower Miller Creek path. So a good handful of different types of active transportation projects throughout the region. The projects that you see in black are those that are committed. So certainly the projects associated with the Build Grant and in the Mullen area, as well as a handful of projects in the heart of Missoula that are included as committed as well. So through that recommended scenario, what we do hope we've achieved is, again, building out a multimodal system that works for people that are traveling by all modes, that really focuses on those connections across the region and provides the opportunity to advance some of the most important projects for the region. Projects that didn't get included in the recommended scenario are not lost. So we have what we call the illustrative projects, and the illustrative projects are those that just don't fit within that $181 million funding constraint. There are great projects on the illustrative project list, and so I don't want anyone to think that these are not valuable connections, that they're not important. Part of the reason that we maintain an illustrative project list is to provide a lot of flexibility moving forward. There are occasions where you might find an opportunity to secure a federal or a state grant. You might find a private source of funding that gives you the ability to advance one of these projects versus another. And so having them on the illustrative projects list gives the MPO, gives the city and county that flexibility. A couple examples of that: the Riverfront Triangle non-motorized bridge. That is an important project. It is one that has come up for folks throughout the process, but it is also one that is quite expensive and that we felt like presented an opportunity to potentially be a public-private partnership, to be partially funded by development moving forward. And so it is on the illustrative list in case those opportunities arise, but is not something that we included in the recommended list. So again, there are a good number of great projects that are on the illustrative list. We did do a screen to make sure that anything that we are including has at least some level of feasibility. But a lot of the things that didn't make it to the recommended list are, again, really just because we are working with a pretty constrained amount of money when you think about this plan going out over 30 years. So let me pause there for a quick second. Erin, what did I miss in terms of the recommended and illustrative projects?
I don't think you missed anything. I think in terms of an overall summary, that's a pretty good presentation. I mean, obviously there are a lot of other specific projects that are in there that we haven't touched on, and we can talk about if there's interest from council, but
yeah, so I'd be happy, Mirta, if it's okay with you, I'd be happy to invite questions from council at this point before we jump into the programs and funding.
Yeah, sorry, I had to stop my camera because my internet is unstable. So I hope you can hear me. Heather, go ahead.
Thanks, Marta. So you mentioned, Jennifer, that we have $181 million worth of projects over 30 years. Obviously, that's not including inflation, which is going to be substantially larger, but so that works out to $6 million a year. Erin, in particular, how does this dovetail with what we've also heard from Public Works in the past about maintenance projects? I believe Jeremy Keene had said that, you know, we have like $7 million worth of projects. Is this on top of that, or is there one more number that I have forgotten, if you will?
this would be on top of we tried to separate out the dedicated maintenance funds from what we consider available for new project construction. And so there are, and we'll talk a little bit about the funding outlook, but yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the challenges is that we have these needs for new facilities that cost money, but we also have a need to maintain our existing transportation system, and that also costs money. And so all of that relates back, I think, to how the types of projects we're proposing, and how well, you know, how efficient are they, and how well are we maximizing the use of our existing facilities before we're building new ones that we have to maintain and that we don't have funding for. It also relates back to, again, our land use decisions, and, you know, developing more compactly means you have more households paying for the same mile of roadway, or, you know, businesses or whatever that might be. And so all of those efficiency things are going to be really, really key. But the maintenance is a really big part of this. And I think we can touch on that a little bit when we talk about the funding.
Thanks.
Anyone else have questions at this point? Okay, well, we can keep going then, unless, Erin, are you seeing any questions?
Nope, I think that was it for now.
Okay.
No.
All right, great. So let's follow on the question that Heather just asked and talk a little bit about funding. So before we dive into the programs and policies, we thought we'd give you sort of a quick overview of where did these numbers come from, and how are we starting to think about what might be available for the long range plan. So Erin, you want to take this one?
Yeah, so I guess to keep it brief and not dive into the weeds of all of the different funding sources and what they're eligible for and who has control over programming them. Big picture, we're estimating about $1.3 billion over the next 30 years. And that's for all of the different transportation funding sources that we have available, including federal funds, transit funding, state and local dollars. So this would be what would be invested in the Missoula urban area or within the MPO boundary over that 30-year period. About 50% of that is coming from federal funding sources. Some of those are programmed by the MPO, such as our urban funds and our congestion mitigation and air quality funding. So those are sort of locally controlled by the Missoula area through the MPO. But that also includes all the federal funding sources that the state DOT manages at the district or the state level. So things like interstate maintenance or our national highway maintenance. And so those funds primarily go to those state and federal highways that MDT is responsible for maintaining and improving. So 50% federal, and then The other 50% would be coming from local funding sources, whether that's local mill levy for Mountain Line, our gas taxes, and other road maintenance funds. And you can see the way those funds currently sort of break down. About 26% of that future funding would be for specifically allocated to maintenance. That is a restriction on those funding sources, that they are primarily used for maintenance. About a third of that funding is going to transit, and that is a combination of the federal funds and the local mill levies. Transit is a little bit different than other types of investments because it includes things like vehicle costs, operating expenses, maintenance, sort of all the things it takes to run a transit system, which is a little bit different from sort of the other modes like, you know, biking or walking or driving, where those vehicle and operator costs are part of sort of the private side. So each individual household pays for their own vehicle costs and operating costs for that vehicle. And so it's really just the infrastructure that's included. And that leaves about 40% or a little over 40% for capital improvements, and then about 1% for ongoing programs that we have in place. And so what this is showing, and what the next slide is going to reiterate, one, that we have some decisions around sort of how we're investing those capital improvements and how much of that can go to help support things like our ongoing maintenance, our transit, or our programs versus building new facilities. But then also there's a sort of been a shift over the last several decades in terms of where the funding is coming from, and it's shifted from the federal government to those local funding sources. So we're projecting 50% of our future discretionary revenue is coming from those local funding sources. Within that discretionary, as I said, most of that is local, and you see that on this table. We have a few federal funding sources that we're projecting would be available for our local priorities. Those include a small amount of highway safety improvement projects that we would be submitting to the state to get funding through HSIP. We have the Transportation Alternatives as a grant program that is conducted statewide, and we've received a little bit of funding through that program, but not substantial. And so, you know, estimating that there would be some from that program to help us do projects. And then our two biggest federal funding sources are Congestion, Mitigation, and Air Quality, and our Surface Transportation Program. And one of the challenges there is that surface transportation is really committed to the Russell Street project through at least 2028 or 2029. So that's really looking out, you know, 2030 and beyond before we have that funding available. So that leaves us with our local sources, things like the city gas tax, and impact fees, and our tax increment financing, and road district property tax assessments are really the bulk of that $181 million that we have projected moving forward. And I think that's where this plan is, you know, it's put together by the MPO. This is a federally required plan, but when we start looking out over the future, there is a huge hole that the local funding is filling in terms of our transportation infrastructure. And so I think this plan can be really helpful for all of you as you start doing CIP programming and thinking about where those local funds are being prioritized. And hopefully this plan will be helpful in that work, and that the decisions you make will be really critical to how well the region functions in terms of its transportation system.
We got a couple of questions, and I just wanted to point out that this is why it's important for us to have a system in place where development pays its share of the cost of the system, because we're not getting those funds from the federal government in the way that we used to. Let's see. Heather and then Jordan.
Thanks, Parker. So I know the state legislature right now is considering canceling our ability to actually impose a gas tax at the city, and I would assume maybe at the county level. And holy smokes, if we don't have that kind of gas tax on a user basis, it then sends the message to me that then for us to do these other kinds of projects that our community needs, we're going to have to raise impact fees or rely more on the MRA in order to help fund those things. And I think that is a disastrous way to try and look at funding. Do any of you know how the legislature right now is looking at reneging on the locally voted upon gas taxes? Or what your thoughts are about that?
Erin, do you want to chime in on status? And then I have thoughts
Yeah.
about gas taxes.
The latest that I know is that I believe that bill passed out of committee. But that was the latest that I saw earlier this week.
I think, Heather, part of what you are raising is a really important question for all municipalities, whether you are in danger of losing your ability to use a gas tax or not. Gas tax revenues have been declining nationally as vehicles get more and more fuel efficient, as people move to more electric vehicles, and ideally as we move more people to active transportation and transit. And so it is a challenging source of funding in terms of being sustainable over the long term anyway. Not that I want it to go away, not that I want you all to lose your ability to use that funding source, because it is critically important right now, especially when you look at this mix of funding. But I do think that this really highlights the need to continue to work with the legislature and continue to think creatively about what those other sources of funding might be. So there are not a lot, quite frankly, that are available to you all at this point beyond what you're already using. But regions across the country are exploring different types of user fees, road usage charges. People are using parking revenues in different ways. There are a variety of different sources that can be discussed, but what is really important is having something that is sustainable that you can count on year after year.
Right. I mean, it's a third of the revenue for our discretionary funding. That's a large chunk. All right.
Yeah, and I guess just to clarify that on that too, the city gas tax includes all of the various gas tax that we get, and so there's the statewide gas tax, the BARSA, and then the local option fuel tax are sort of all wrapped up in that. But yeah, it's an important point that it is a big gas tax in general is a big chunk of our funding, and definitely agree with Jennifer that is likely to be a dwindling funding source moving forward. And I think a lot of other states, I think there's a lot of innovative work out there, places trying to come up with what the replacement for a gas tax is, and so we'll see how that unfolds in the future.
Jordan?
Thanks. You know, that was the line of questioning I was going to have as well. And so just to be clear, Erin, that 17.2 million is the gas tax that's in question with House Bill 464?
No, that's just revenue that the county receives from the various gas taxes. So we try to split up, gas tax that's going to the city versus gas tax that's going to the county for there. Okay. So the local option fuel tax currently is being split 50-50 between the city and the county. And so when we were estimating that, we just split that between those okay. Two. Just knowing that the county gas tax includes areas outside of the urban area. And so we wanted to be clear on that when we were estimating revenues, that not all of that is available for use in the urban area.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess this table I think is probably one of the most important take-home messages of the realistic funding constrained environment that we're operating in, and I think it's really important. This highlights the importance of the ability to generate funds locally and the ability to have some local control over funds. It also is a good illustration of how we can't fully rely on federal funds to meet all of our or to meet even a majority of our funding needs. So this, I would just highlight this as a cautionary table that should make us really be concerned about the future state of our infrastructure if we don't have diversity of funding sources and if we don't have the ability to levy funding sources at the local level. I think we saw last spring some of the infrastructure backlog that we're looking at the local level, and this table helps put that in perspective to me. So thanks. I guess there's not really a question that, but thanks for including this.
Yeah, and go ahead, sir. Just in a brief response to that, Jordan, I think I think it's not all necessarily dire outlooks. That I think there is a strong push at the federal level to try to get some additional infrastructure funding. And so this would then be sort of the conservative outlook that if that doesn't happen, this is what we have. It also, I think, reinforces the approach of trying to be more efficient with our transportation infrastructure, that we, something like Russell Street expansion is a $80 to $100 million project. And that could be 50% of our funding over the next 30 years. So maybe we could do one, maybe two of those projects, and that would be it, if we invested all of our funding in those. And so it's not really an option without some big infusion of federal dollars to do those kinds of, capacity expansion projects where you're widening roads, which is one of the reasons, we're focused on, more efficiency, better connectivity, trying to increase transit and multimodal, because you can absorb a lot more growth and capacity on our existing transportation system that way. And we can be more efficient and not be spending all of our, committing all of our funding over the next 20 years to one project that does a small capacity expansion.
I think that, Erin, it also highlights the need for us to be prepared for any potential federal grant, position ourselves well so that if we know there's a grant, that we can just go for it if we have a potential project in line that can serve those big portions of the community, or those big projects that we don't have the local funding for.
Absolutely.
Julie.
I just wanted to comment, since Erin brought up the Russell Street expansion. I know that there's plenty of constituents in the Franklin to the Fort neighborhood who would rather see that $80 million spent on a lot of other projects and not on widening Russell Street. I mean, so I think it's good to bring those conversations out, that we have choices that we can make. And I am supportive of the idea of looking at a lot more local projects and improving that connectivity and the ability to get places in the multimodal ways. So I appreciate the work, Erin.
Okay. Well, if it's all right, I'll move on so we can spend just a couple minutes on programs and policies as well. But this has been a really good discussion around funding, and we are making the funding conversation part of what we're talking about with the public right now as well, just to daylight some of these issues. Not everybody understands how we pay for transportation and how limited transportation funding sources are. So I think it is important to keep that going as we move into the last phases of the plan. So the last piece that we are sharing with the public right now and wanted to get a few thoughts from you all on today is around programs and policies. So certainly the infrastructure components, the projects in a long-range transportation plan are critically important, and that is where most of the funding ends up being programmed. But we've talked and heard from you from the beginning of this process that the programs and policies, those non-infrastructure supports, are also really important. You all have set very ambitious mode share targets for the region and for the city. And as we think about what it will take to achieve those targets, it takes more than just infrastructure. We could build every one of the projects that is identified in the recommended projects list and still need more support to continue moving people toward walking and rolling, biking, and transit modes, and encouraging people to try something other than driving for some trips when they can. So the programs and policies are a piece of that. And you do have a handful of really strong programs already in place in the region. And so part of what we've looked at through the long range plan is an opportunity to expand those and to make some recommendations for you all to consider around what else you might do to encourage people to travel in different ways, to really enhance access and safety, and just to round out the projects that are recommended in the plan. So we'll give you just a couple examples of what we have been exploring and what we are likely to recommend in the plan. Again, this is something that we are sharing with the public and getting some feedback on what is most important to people. I'm going to go into transportation demand management and street types and design standards in a bit more detail on the next couple slides. So I'll just flag the bottom 3 bullets on this slide as a couple of additional examples. There are communities that, much like Missoula, have a Safe Routes to Schools program, but other communities are thinking about and implementing a Safe Routes to Transit program. So really focused on that first and last mile connection to bus stops. Other communities like Los Angeles have implemented a Safe Routes for Seniors program, where they really focus on the destinations that older adults are prioritizing and make sure that the walking and rolling connections to those locations are very strong, and that people understand the routes and networks and have the supports needed to be really safe as they're traveling. So those are a couple of program examples. Emerging mobility is something I think that we've talked about before, whether that is micromobility like scooters, like bike share, or other types of emerging mobility, whether that's autonomous vehicles or connected vehicles. Many cities and regions are setting the principles that they want to have private operators follow as they think about using the right of way to provide more of these transportation options for people. So that is something that will be included as part of the long range plan, just in terms of how the city and region might begin to think about what those principles should be for Missoula. There's been a lot of interest in the region in terms of passenger rail. There's some work happening on that front. And so identifying some recommendations around more of those interregional connections and future studies that could be done to advance some of those priorities are another example of policy and program recommendations. So I did want to spend just a quick second on a couple of these. One of the things that in conversations with our technical advisory committee in particular and with staff, we've heard a lot of interest in being able to build on some of the work that you've been doing in the Mullen area and really establish street types and design standards that could be applied more broadly across the city, county, and region. And so this particular example comes from Grand Rapids, Michigan. This is their Vital Streets program. And part of what Grand Rapids did in identifying street types was do a couple of things. So street types enable you to move beyond the functional classification, so arterial, collector, and move into thinking about the ways that land use and the use of the transportation network connect. And part of what that means is that Grand Rapids has identified priority modes for each of the collectors and arterials in their network. So for example, they may have designated Fuller, this street that is showing in orange, as a priority freight route, whereas they might have designated Aberdeen as a priority bike route. So this is a way to really be clear about what the expectations are in terms of which mode comes first on different streets. And then they've complemented that by going to the level of setting design standards for those different street types. And what this can do is, as you have the opportunity to touch a street for maintenance or for tree planting or because there is a new construction project, you understand the approach that you want to take and how you are trying to design that street for which modes moving forward. This is helpful for new development as well, if you've got the opportunity to really set the amount of right-of-way that you are going to get from a development, and then be really clear about what the facilities are, what the features are that get included in that street type. So this is something that Missoula might want to consider. We will identify this as a recommendation to consider in the plan. Another example that really builds on your Missoula in Motion program comes from Eugene, Oregon. And this is a blend of both program and policy. And Eugene has a lot of similarities to Missoula, and so we really like this example as one for you all to consider. And what Eugene has done is take their transportation demand management program to another level and really created an action plan that builds on, again, a lot of similarities to what you have in Missoula. They have a strong transportation system plan, they have a Vision Zero or a safety plan, they've got a climate recovery plan, and very ambitious mode share goals. And so what they focused on is revamping their transportation demand management policy and their traffic impact analysis requirements so that the process is very clear for developers, that they are articulating what it is going to take in terms of thinking multimodally and moving forward to clear objectives to help support development as it comes in, but then also, for example, to articulate what does a new employer need to do in setting a TDM policy. So new employer comes into Missoula, you're able to say, we expect that you are going to have 60% of your trips made by non-driving modes. Great. How are you going to do that? What are the programs you're going to put in place? How are we going to monitor that? And how are we going to know that you are being active in tracking that? So that's a piece of what Eugene is doing in their TDM policy. And then in their traffic impact analysis requirements, they're really moving to thinking more about a network approach. So moving beyond just vehicle level of service, thinking about trips by all modes, but then also thinking about the ways that facilities connect beyond just that particular development. So thinking across the intersections. Another thing that Eugene has done, which certainly in a region that is growing as quickly as the Missoula region is, this can be very valuable, is offering a menu of options for what you want to see when it comes to development. So we often hear from developers, not just in Missoula, but in places all across the country that, you know, they have ideas and they want to do what the city wants them to do, but there's just not a great process. It's very difficult to move through the development review. And so Eugene has really focused in on making that easier and more seamless for developers so that they're sure they're getting the multimodal projects that they want and the types of facilities, the types of sidewalks, of bike facilities, of complete streets that they want as growth happens. So it's an interesting example that, again, would really allow you to build on what is already working with the encouragement and education programs that Missoula in Motion offers and present some ways to really be able to provide certainty for developers and new employers, but then also help to advance your priorities and goals. So those are just a couple of examples. I think I will just quickly breeze through the last slide here and then can open it up again for some additional questions. So as Erin mentioned, we are in the midst of this last big round of public engagement. This has been ongoing for about a month. We've got materials on our website, including, I mentioned, an interactive map where you can explore the recommended scenario, as well as the illustrative projects. We've got some survey questions for people about funding and about programs, and then are hosting 2 virtual open houses, one this evening at 6 p.m. and another tomorrow at noon. It'll be the same content in both of those presentations, but really trying to provide an opportunity for people to give us a little bit more feedback on these items that we've run through with you all today. So that is, that survey then will be live through the end of this month, so through next week as we wrap up our revisions to the recommended scenario, dialing in the programs and policies. And then we anticipate releasing a draft of the long range plan for public review at the very, very end of April. So folks would have the month of May to review and then bring that back to the MPO committees and then eventually to City Council for adoption, hopefully in June and maybe into the early part of July. So that is where we are. I would be happy to answer any questions, but before I stop sharing my screen, Erin, anything that you wanted to go back to in those last slides?
No, I don't think so. I just thinking about those as really good examples of how we can supplement our investment in transportation system to, you know, tie it more to our land use and development, be thinking about all of our different goals and how can we sort of streamline all of that and just be really intentional with how we're making investments and how we're leveraging those programs to support the work that we're doing on infrastructure, I think is really important.
Great.
Great, thank you. Julie and then Heather.
Thank you, Jennifer and Erin, both for that presentation. A couple of things that piqued my interest was the safe routes for seniors idea. Of course, our safe routes for school could use a lot of work first. I know a couple of safe routes for school designated streets that are not safe for children to walk on, but so we got some work to do there. But the other idea that you just touched on too, of like trying to get this communication going between what's happening in the development community and what's happening with our transportation network. For example, you know, I think it's almost 2 years ago now, we approved a zone change for the low-income senior housing on 9th Street in the Franklin to the Fort neighborhood. And almost immediately on the heels of that, Mountain Line took away the bus stop that was closest to that senior housing project. And I brought that point up to the folks at Mountain Line when they were asking for public feedback. And I'm just wondering, I know it's, this is, you know, it really reaches outside of your shop, Erin, but I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how we can make that communication happen better so we don't have just, I mean, to me, that seemed like a total disconnect.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think part of it is communicating and having really good plans in place that we could, you know, making sure that our plans and our development review are integrated and being able to anticipate some of that. And I think making sure that transit is aware of those things and can make decisions based on some of those future opportunities. I don't know that there's a good example for that or a good approach for that specific example, other than, you know, that feels like we want to be prioritizing transit in the places that need it the most. But if our development review can be thinking about these things more in depth and our plans are thinking about them and we integrate them better and doing things like a TDM policy that really allows private development to have some creativity and flexibility and outline, here is how we want to help implement those goals, and that provides something that, you know, we can use in working with Mountain Line or with our own infrastructure investments. So I think this is hopefully a step in the right direction to start coordinating all of that and thinking about those investments and making sure that there's more predictability sort of for everybody involved, including Mountain Line, and in terms of their predictability and where their routes are going to go, and not sort of being pulled in lots of different directions because no one really knows. You know, people want to shift a route 2 blocks off an existing Mountain Line route, or, you know, those kinds of decisions are tough as well. So.
Okay, Heather.
Thanks. Erin, I really have to say thank you for all the years of helping me connect dots around transportation and then how it plays into our land use planning. I really have gotten a really great education listening to you over the years. So one of the things I recall, it costs roughly $1,000 per foot for putting in a new street. Ballpark. And I bring that up because a couple of weeks ago, I was on a phone call with my colleagues with the League of Cities and Towns, chatting with our new MDT director. And there was a comment about, well, it'd sure be nice if cyclists would pay their fair share of in those trail connections and bike lanes and the such. And I come back to this like, well, a lot of it comes down to property taxes, and we all pay property taxes, whether we are renters or owners. But I think their point, they see cyclists' needs as very expensive things that they don't pay for. And yet I look at that those particular costs are actually much lower over the long term than they are upfront compared to our typical road infrastructure. So my question to you, in all of this engagement that you've been doing with the community, is there a conversation talking about what those economic trade-offs that we are making, both short-term and long-term, are those happening? Do people understand the benefits both from a fiscally responsible perspective as well as an environmentally sustainable perspective, and that they actually can be a win-win?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're trying to have those conversations. You know, there's a lot to cover in the long range plan, and that is sort of one aspect of it. But I will keep reiterating that the efficiency of our system is going to save us a lot of dollars over the long run. And thinking about capacity, often our roadway, just as an example, our roadway capacity is really only constrained for maybe an hour a day. And so if you can make smaller scale, cheaper, more effective investments that allow you to sort of either distribute that amongst different modes or different times, you have saved yourself that $80 to $100 million it might take to expand the roadway for that one limited hour of transportation. And so it doesn't mean that every trip that everyone makes has to be by bike or walk or bus, but during that peak travel time, you really do want to maximize your use of that space, both space and time. And so I think that is one of the areas which will save money down the road. And so it's maybe less important about who's paying what and more about how much are we paying for some of these investments.
Okay, we are almost out of time. Jordan, go ahead.
Thanks. I just want to commend you for a great product so far. It's been really great working with you, Aaron, and Jennifer on this. And I think one of the things that I think is really exciting is that we're sticking with the mode split goal concept. I think that mode split goals, actually at the beginning of this process, Jennifer and I had a conversation around how mode split goals really are a broader view of solving the problems that we have than reducing vehicle miles traveled or reducing emissions or any of those things. And our mode split goals will do those other noble objectives will get accomplished as we accomplish our mode split goals. But I think our mode split goals also encapsulate, a good transportation plan is good for our housing policy. Transportation is the second largest household cost. A good transportation plan it implements our climate goals. A good transportation plan will help us preserve agricultural land. And so there are so many things that are solved by a good transportation plan, and I think we're poised to have a good transportation plan at the end of this process. So I'm really excited, and I think that our staff and the folks at Nelson Nygaard have done great work, and I really look forward to implementing this, which is going to be the next challenge, I guess. But so far, just really happy with what we're seeing.
You're here. Last and very quickly, Heidi, please.
I just wanted to, I think, actually echo what Jordan just said about how the importance of this plan upholding all those other community goals we have it's just first and foremost. And just to say that the kickoff event for this long-range transportation plan was the last public event that my family and I went to. And just how well executed that was. And just, I thought it was really unique because it was super engaging and interesting to people of all ages. Like my kids loved it. They got to fill out things. They got to put colored stickers on things. And it was just a really inclusive, fun experience. So I hope we can get back to that soon.
Great. Thank you, everyone. And yes, thank you all for your work. I'm excited and grateful for it. So thank you.
Thank you all.
And with that, we only have one housekeeping item, and that is approval of our minutes. Any changes to the minutes? Okay, seeing none, those stand approved and be adjourned. Thank you, everyone.